Hey there, Mama. You're listening to the Lift the Shame podcast. I'm your host, Crystal, mama of 5 and your family's intuitive eating dietitian, here to help you cut through the diet culture clutter so you can enjoy freedom with food as a family. I'm on a mission to help you end the generational legacy of diet culture in your home so you can experience motherhood free from food guilt and body shame. Listen in weekly for guidance on how you can ditch diet culture, heal your relationship with food and your body, and confidently raise intuitive eaters. Let's dive in and lift the shame together. Welcome back to the show, Mama. I'm so excited to dive into this topic with you. And these are one of those topics that I wish was more of a conversation. I wish I could sit across from you in a coffee shop and talk to you and get to know you and hear your story. It matters. Your story matters. And I want to help you in this episode, in the short time that we have together, start to uncover and unpack this idea of what it means to reparent yourself around food and the importance of that and why it matters. You know, I think so many of us have been through significant journeys in our lives that have shaped and formed our ideas and our beliefs and our attitudes about food and our body, much of which I think a lot of us wish that maybe didn't happen or didn't exist, and wish that we could just forget about it and put it in the past and sweep it under the rug. And today I just want to invite you to come into the space with me and explore it and bring it out into the open and start to shed some light on it, because it can be so helpful in not just helping you heal, but supporting you in holding space for your child and helping them learn how to trust their body and how to have more positive experiences around food. I know in so many conversations with many of you that I've heard just the fear and the concern about your child somehow experiencing the same things that you did with your own relationship with food, whether it's walking through an eating disorder or experiencing shame in your body. You know, I hear the agony in your voice when you say, I don't want my child to struggle with the same things that I did, especially around food and bodies, because it can be a lifelong struggle if we never take the time to address it and heal it through it. And so I want to invite you into this conversation about understanding your food story and why it matters and why it really is the first step to learning how to reparent yourself around food and your body. And the reason why this matters is because we have to understand it. We have to understand our history and our food story in order to rewrite our feeding legacy. And again, I understand that some of this can be really painful and excruciating, especially for those of us that have learned to disassociate from that part of our lives because it has felt so painful and hurtful. And I just want you to listen to this with curiosity and also compassion for yourself. And, you know, also just understand that some of these things, hearing some of these things may feel triggering or upsetting or distressing. So please just go gently with yourself as we talk about some of these concepts. And again, understand that whatever your story has been, it matters. And I think a lot of us have grown up and felt unseen in different ways. Feeling unseen and feeling unheard can be fuel to the fire for the eating disorder behaviors. And it feels like something that we can control, something that we have agency over. And that's a big deal when you've grown up not feeling like you have that over your life or over your body. And so understanding your food story is really going to help you move through some of these layers. And ultimately, the more that you can find healing through your story, the better that you can show up for your own child. And I love this quote by Daniel Siegel in his book, The Power of Showing Up, which reads, "When you develop what we call a coherent narrative about your own past, you can be much more intentional and consistent as a parent and much more effective in the ways you show up for your kids." I love that. And I think it's so relevant to what we're talking about today. You know, when we talk about our past and our food story and our history around food in our bodies, the intention is not to shame anyone or cast blame on anyone, I think we can all agree, especially now as parents, that our parents did the best they could with the information and the resources they had at the time. Just as we're doing the same for our kids, we don't know everything. Parenting is hard, and we're trying to do the best that we can with the resources at our disposal. I want, again, to encourage you just to start to understand your story in a compassionate and non-judgmental way, so that you can learn how to heal and meet your needs in a more effective way. And ultimately, that is going to help you better show up for your child. And I like to call it, and again, you may have heard this in different circles, but when we talk about reparenting, learning and understanding the needs that we had as children or at various stages of our life that perhaps went unmet. When we can start to understand what some of those things are, we can show up for that inner child now. And I know it may seem kind of arbitrary, but we carry those different parts of us throughout our lives, and they show up in different ways. And I think for a lot of us, feeding kids is such a reenactment where it kind of forces us to be in this position of parallel processing, or, we're processing through a situation that we experienced as a child that our child is now going through. And I know in conversations with many of you, I've heard that. And I've heard that come up in a lot of client sessions. And I've certainly experienced that myself, where I see my child going through something that triggers a lot of distress within my own body because it's parallel to a situation that I went through as a child that may have been traumatic or triggering or upsetting in different ways. And when we can start to explore that and put those pieces together, it really does empower us to take care of ourselves in a new way, to find deeper healing in our relationship with food, and then again, ultimately to better show up and support our child. And, I know so many of you, like myself, are just passionate about wanting to shift these generational cycles of diet culture and these narratives, like these old narratives that have been around for so long, right? Telling us that our body is wrong, that our appetites can't be trusted, that we have to shrink ourselves, that we can't trust ourselves to eat certain foods. Those narratives are hard to rewire because, well, for a couple things, for one, they've been around much longer than your lifespan, right? Like those are narratives and things that we picked up in various ways, in various forms. And those are things that have existed for a very long time. And the other part of that too is that those narratives have served a purpose in our life at some point or another. And understanding those narratives can start to help us leave what no longer serves us and our children and rewrite the narrative that we want our kids to understand about food and their bodies so that truly they can have a different legacy. That's the exciting part of this. And again, it's exciting and it's painful, and it can bring up a lot of grief as you begin to understand some of the things that you needed but didn't have as a kid. And the powerful part of that is that not only can you start to learn how to give that to yourself, but you can start to give your kids the things that you needed but didn't experience, especially as it pertains to food and to your body. So what does this look like in terms of practical application? And I know some of this might seem really arbitrary. And so I want to try to help and put together some practical tangibles that you can take away from this episode. I also will have available for you a free download that will have some reflection questions and journal prompts for you to consider. And my hope is that you can take these things and, really think about it and dive into it a little bit deeper. And maybe it's something that you can take to a counselor or a therapist that you may be working with or a dietitian that you're seeing to really break this and unpack it and start to understand it more. So that will be in the show notes for you. And I hope that's a helpful resource. But before we get to that, let's first talk about what are some of the common wounds or traumas that we might experience around food and our bodies. And again, I just want you to hold some compassionate space for yourself as you think about this and reflect on this, and also know that you are not alone as you reflect on these experiences in your life. And just as a reminder that we have our virtual support group and community called Lift the Shame. And if you're not part of that yet, I would love to invite you to be part of it. It's an amazing community of mothers who are healing their relationship with food and really rewriting the narrative around food and bodies for their children. And so I'll also link to that in the show notes. But the one thing that I love about that community is how it gives voice and space to the like-minded mothers and also experiences that we've had. I think so often when we're going through these trials and challenges around food in our bodies, we truly can feel like we are the only ones going through it. And I want you to just consider that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of moms out there who are experiencing similar things and who are questioning their upbringing around food in their bodies and doing this hard work of learning how to heal through it in order to better support their family and themselves. So definitely check out the community if you're looking for a space to be part of and just to connect with other moms who are going through something similar. So back to this question, what are some of the common wounds or traumas that we may have experienced in our childhood and in our upbringing around food and our bodies? And I'm going to list some things here, and this is certainly not, exclusive. There are many other scenarios that I, just for the sake of time, won't be able to cover today. I just want to acknowledge that everyone has been through something different in that sense. Like, I think sometimes when we hear other people talking about their trauma or their stories, we might feel like, oh, mine's not that bad, and dismiss some of the painful things that we may have been through because we compare it to what someone else has been through. I really want to encourage you to acknowledge, first of all, and just practice some awareness around some of those painful parts of your life that really were hard and difficult. And maybe you felt alone in that pain. And it's important to give voice to that, again, especially growing up feeling like maybe it wasn't a big deal. A lot of us have experienced gaslighting in different forms, especially around food in our bodies, where we were told it's not a big deal. You're making such a big deal out of nothing, or you're so sensitive. I don't even understand why this is bothering you. Different variations of that where our reality is being dismissed and minimized. And whatever your experience has been is valid. And I hope you can give a voice back to yourself in acknowledging that your pain and your story, whatever it has looked like, is real. So some of these kind of traumas and the way they show up in our childhood around food and our bodies could look like, and again, this is specific to food and bodies. So for example, if you struggled with food insecurity as a child and didn't know when or where your next meal was coming from, if your family didn't have enough food to go around for everyone, and that was a concern in your home, like that is something that is part of your food story and your food narrative, and can definitely make it challenging in different ways in terms of how you engage with food today. If mealtimes ever felt unsafe, if your caregivers were emotionally absent or neglectful or physically neglectful, this is something that can absolutely play a role in how your mealtimes panned out. If someone was there for you when you were eating, kind of figuring out like what do you remember about your mealtime experiences and what shaped those experiences? What was going on in your home? For example, a mom who may have struggled with mental health concerns or who was dealing with depression may not have been able to show up for her children in the ways that they needed her. And oftentimes as children, we internalize our parents' feelings as our fault, right? Like, it's my fault. There's something wrong with me, because mommy is sad or mommy's upset and it's my fault. And so I just want you to kind of make some of those connections and begin to understand how this narrative around food and your body may have formed. If food was ever withheld from you as a child, that can also be another form of food trauma that shaped your narrative around food. If food was used as a punishment, for example, if I see this a lot with sweets, right? Where sweets were only provided if behavior was met to par or to expectations, or food was withheld if a child was acting out or behaving in a certain way that was upsetting to a parent or caregiver. On the flip side of this, I also see if food was ever forced on a child, that can also shape a painful narrative around food, right? I see this a lot with pickier eaters and kids that are just more selective or have more sensory sensitivities, where, a parent or caregiver who, out of their own fear and concern, may have pushed food on a child and tried to get them to eat in a certain way that maybe they weren't capable of. Other things here are being introduced to dieting at a young age. So, if a parent or caregiver mentioned that they were concerned about your body or your weight, or maybe a doctor said something and your parent was like, okay, I have to do something about that, and perhaps put you on a diet as a child. I've heard a lot of stories where a parent or caregiver, was maybe dieting themselves and essentially invited their child to be part of that, like Weight Watchers, right? I've talked to a lot of moms who remember going to Weight Watcher meetings with their moms and who remember being taught how to count points and counting points with their mom. So, that can be very traumatic as a child, because essentially you're internalizing this narrative of, your body being wrong, your body not being trusted. Another thing I see is comparison among siblings. So if you had, let's say, if your body size was a lot different compared to your sibling, and perhaps your parents or caregivers treated you differently because of that. Maybe they allowed your sibling to have certain foods like sweets, but withheld that from you. And again, all of these experiences shape the narrative that you formed around food and your body. And really, it's the messages that you start to internalize from those experiences that become your inner voice around food and your body. And that inner voice is what's showing up today when you are feeding your kids and engaging with your children around food and their bodies. So for example, a mom who was put on a diet at an early age, right? And I tend to see this happen around that pre-adolescent age, where it's actually normal for pre-adolescent girls to gain a significant amount of weight as their body is preparing to go through puberty. And what happens is that can be really scary for a lot of parents who have their own trauma around food and their bodies, and who are concerned about their child's body changing. And again, if nobody held space for you as a child when your body was changing, that's going to set the alarms off in your head when you see your child's body changing too. So I want you to think about the potential messages that young girl is now internalizing when her parents are putting her on a diet. Again, doing the best that they could and doing what they thought was best for their child at the time. But what messages did that young girl, did your 12-year-old self start to believe about her body when her parents are putting her on a diet or telling her she can't eat certain things or not allowing her to have certain foods in the home because it's not part of the diet, right? Like that starts to shape this narrative that we have to follow external rules in order to tell us what we eat. We can't trust our body. Being in a larger body or being in a changing body is wrong. There's something wrong with me. Those are the narratives that become internalized and that inform how we engage with food and our bodies for the rest of our life. And I know it can be really devastating to look back and to examine some of those things. And again, I just want to encourage you to hold space and compassion for yourself as you reflect on some of these experiences, knowing that you can find healing through them and knowing that you can work through them and examine, okay, what was it that my 12-year-old self actually needed instead of being put on a diet, right? And again, going back to that example of what I was saying about parallel processing, these things tend to surface for us when we see our kids going through the same situation. So now as a mom, let's say that you have a child who's pre-adolescent and experiencing a lot of body changes as they prepare for puberty. You might find yourself alarmed. You might find a lot of distress coming up for you as you see your child's body changing. You might find yourself worried or concerned when you notice that your child's eating certain foods or has a higher appetite and is also in a larger body or a changing body. And I know as a parent, especially as you're working on healing your own relationship with food, you might feel really guilty for having some of these thoughts or concerns about your own child or fears, or you might feel guilty for the reaction that you're having towards your child, especially as you're working towards supporting them to building a more positive experience around food. But I want you to understand who's showing up in those situations. And it's likely that part of you, that 12-year-old girl whose own body was changing and who was put on a diet, and all those messages that you were now internalizing because of that experience that you had. And again, I'm just talking through one potential example, and there are countless of them out there. And I want you to know that there is a reason why you're reacting to your child the way that you might be. It's typically triggering a situation that was uncomfortable for you or brought up a lot of pain for you or was traumatic for you in different ways. And again, the point of doing this and the point of reflection is not to shame anyone, but to understand the pieces so that we can better show up for our child. Because as you start to heal through these past experiences, if you were that 12-year-old girl that was put on a diet and told your body's not okay, you need to lose weight, whatever that looked like, it's really powerful to go back and ask yourself, what did I need at that age? And that is a clue to help you start to reparent yourself today, right? Like, what did you need to hear at that age when your body was changing? What did you need from your caregivers? How did you need them to show up? What would it look like for them to hold space for you in a changing body, right? And all of this is new for so many of us because we never had this model to us. And, I also have compassion for our caregivers, understanding that they're highly saturated in a culture that is dieting and a multi-billion-dollar dieting industry that makes a profit based on telling us that our bodies are wrong and that we need to change them. And so I think it can be helpful not to look at a person in particular, but look at the bigger picture altogether and understand how we're all victims of this paradigm, right? That's failing us. And again, I think it's really powerful to explore this through this lens of what did you need at those certain ages that were painful for you? How can you start to give those things to yourself now? And understanding that and practicing that will also help you to show up and give those things to your kids so that when you have a child who's going through puberty and their body is changing, it may still bring up some discomfort, but you will be able to show up for them in a more powerful way because you're learning to give yourself what you needed as you went through those different phases and stages. Another thing to consider is what stages are triggering for you with your kids. Again, our children can be such an amazing part of our healing when we are open and curious about what they're going through. And I think our kids can be our greatest teachers. And one of these reflection questions that you can ask yourself are, what behaviors or ages do you find triggering in your child around food and your body? That's a clue of something that you may have needed at that age, or something that you might have experienced at that age that you need some resolution through. I hope this can help you start to see the bigger picture of what is happening here. And again, I want you to just keep in mind that all of our journeys and experiences around food are going to be different. What's most important is that you're paying attention to what was painful for you. Sometimes that can be hard because, again, we learn to dissociate from our pain because we have learned that that is unsafe. And really, I do believe that is a mechanism, a function of the eating disorder or a eating disorder that serves us. It's like a protective function, right? It helps us to not have to live in our pain. And if you have no other tools to help you unpack this and learn through it and heal through it, it's going to be really overwhelming at times to experience some of this pain in your body. So I really just want to encourage you to go gently with yourself as you listen to some of these ideas and reflection questions. And if you can do this along the support of other people, I think even better, because I want you to know that you're not alone as you navigate and try to make sense of your own experiences and your narrative. We are going to continue a second part of this conversation, but one thing that I want you to consider are just some reflection questions to help you take this deeper. And again, I will have these questions for you in a downloadable PDF in the show notes that you can use to help you, journal, to think through this a little bit more. And again, the point of this is to help you better understand your story so that you can begin to rewrite your feeding legacy. When you can understand those pieces of your history and those parts of your life that are still wounded or needing extra love and attention and care, that is only going to empower you to better show up for your kids. And that is such a crucial element of shifting the cycle, because that will enable you now to move out of that perpetual cycle that has essentially passed on from generations. And that's not possible if you're not able to pause and examine and learn and listen to your own story and give voice to your story again. So as we conclude our time together for today, here are some takeaway questions that I'll read for you. And I just want you to consider these after this episode. One helpful starting place is to understand what were some of your primary caregivers' core beliefs and feelings about food and bodies. So this might be your parents. This could be extended family. If you could trace it even further back to grandparents, I think sometimes that's even more powerful to help you really see how this has been passed through in generations. And maybe you don't have connections with some of those family members anymore, and maybe you can talk to other people that can help you get a better idea or picture of what that looked like, especially if we're talking about generations that are further back, like grandparents or great-grandparents. But just understanding what were some of their core beliefs, and what do you think influenced some of those behaviors and beliefs about food? For example, this is just to give you a little idea here. I myself am a first-generation American. Both my parents immigrated here to the United States and came from, extreme poverty and war-torn countries. And this absolutely played a role in terms of how they thought about food and engaged with us around food. Having those experiences of food insecurity and war, that's like that intergenerational trauma that gets passed through. So I want you to think about what were some of those things in your family's history that influenced their attitudes and behaviors around food. This can also help you hold more compassion for them too. And then how did these attitudes and behaviors impact your upbringing around food? How did this influence your narrative around food and your body? So think through some of these things. Other questions I want you to consider as you start to think about the future and what you want to rewrite, right? This part of rewriting your feeding legacy for your children. I want you to think about the parts of your upbringing around food and your body that you would like to share with your child. Maybe that's certain traditions or positive memories that you would like to recreate with them. On the other note, I also want you to think about aspects of your upbringing that you would like to be different for your children. Those are important to consider. And I think if you can materialize that can really help you move through this and understand it even more. Last question here is, and I talked about this before, but what behaviors or ages around your children do you find triggering or distressing around food and body? And what did you possibly need or experience at those ages? We want to lean into our distress and discomfort that surfaces when it comes to engaging with our kids around food and their bodies as clues. They are clues to help us understand what we needed at those times in our lives too. Okay. So I hope those are helpful and gives you some food for thought, no pun intended. And I hope you'll come back and join me next week where we distill this topic even further and talk about, again, more practical applications in terms of, all right, you're understanding your food story. You're starting to put some pieces together with your food history. And now what are some practical applications? How can you start to reparent yourself around food and your body? So we're going to talk about that next week. And I can't wait to continue this conversation with you then. Of course, if you have any questions, thoughts, feedback, please get in touch with me. You can email me hello@crystalcargis.com or connect with me on Instagram @crystalcargis. All right, my friend, I'm sending you so much love and can't wait to connect next week. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Lift the Shame podcast. For more tips and guidance on your motherhood journey, come connect with me on Instagram @crystalcargis. Until next week, Mama, I'll be cheering you on. Bye for now.